This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Welcome to the Friday Morning Break podcast with John Gibbs. In my quest to understand what schools are for, this week I'm interviewing an author, Lekha Sharma, author of Curriculum to Classroom, and now her latest book, Building Culture, a handbook to harnessing human nature to create strong school teams.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And we're back with my guest, Lekha Sharma, who's written this rather wonderful book, Building Culture, a handbook to harness human nature and create strong school teams. And as I was saying a moment ago before we started recording, it was the subtitle that first struck me about this book. It's the emphasis on human nature. And I thought, as I read it, what a humane sort of book it was for a management book. Not only is it well researched and lots of practical stuff, but the emphasis seems to me to be on human beings in a real world, and that schools are organisations made up of people of all kinds. So, what prompted you to write this book? I know it's your second book. You've written other books.
I started writing about curriculum. So my first book was very much talking through the journey of curriculum development in a school. And it was very much a warts and all tale around how we did that and the implementation process and what we learnt. And I think I kind of progressed through my career, and I did a bit of work with the Teacher Development Trust, and I was working on their MPQs. Really amazing time, actually, and I think very formative for me. Looking at leadership development and the kind of ways in which we were developing leaders. And one of the things that the Teacher Development Trust is really hot on is that idea of the human element of leadership, which I absolutely love, and really their ethos really resonated with me. And then I kind of took a step back in my thinking and thought, well, curriculum, teaching and learning, there's such a huge focus on that at the moment. We're in a really exciting time in education where lots of things are being taken from the world of cognitive psychology and cognitive science. And I just thought, what about all these other wonderful areas of psychology, sociology, thinking about organizational psychology? What things could we potentially take from there that might support leaders in our school? And I guess from my experiences of being a leader in a school and understanding what it's like on the ground, it just stood out as something that was hugely important, is that human element of what happens in our schools. So that's probably what inspired me to write the book.
Yeah, I think that came across very strongly in your book. And if I could say there was a theme running through it, it would be the theme of human relationships. You talk about the psychological safety, the culture of a school, the conversations, being open in conversation, the kind of conversations we have. It's all sorts of ways. You think, well, surely that's what you find in schools. You would find it, but I know from my own experience in the schools I taught in, that isn't always the case. That quite often the relationships in schools can be the problem. That there isn't communication. Let's take about this first idea, psychological safety. It seemed to me absolutely crucial to the notion of being able to speak freely and openly in a school. Is your experience that is something? How important do you think that is?
I just think I think it's one of the most important things when we're thinking about the work that goes on in schools, particularly because schools are incredibly complex and challenging places by their very nature, in terms of our purpose of what we're trying to achieve within schools. It's really important work, but it's really hard work. And I think there are psychological safety, essentially that idea that you are able to talk freely, share your questions, your concerns, your mistakes, I think is all the more important in schools, because we don't have time to waste, and we want to make sure that we are doing absolutely everything for our pupils and in service of our pupils. And so I just think having that ability within our teams to have those really honest and open conversations just saves us a lot of time. And it also supports implementation, not only during the planning stages of implementation, but actually when things potentially don't go well or don't go the way we want them to go. Having teams which have a strong sense of psychological safety, and members feel like they are able to say, actually, that's not working and we need to go in a different direction, I think is really important.
That ability for teachers as human beings to feel secure, because there's all sorts of things that might undermine that in any hierarchical organization. I mean, the people you work with are also the people who are going to evaluate you at the end of the year, or during the year there's an evaluative process. So that conflict between formality and the formality, and yet the organizational kind of cohesion and subjectivity. These are your friends. These are people you go to Christmas parties with. These are people you meet in the evening and have coffee with. And at the same time, they're the people that are going to evaluate you and so on. And that tension lies within schools. How can you create a system where, a culture where people feel both secure in their relationships, and yet at the same time you have a formality of evaluation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that trust and psychological safety becomes particularly important when it comes to having conversations about performance and feedback. And I think it comes back to first of all, calling that out. And I think an awareness of that is really important, to say that actually there will be conversations where we are having these direct conversations and we are going to give each other feedback. And that might not necessarily be feedback that feels great. But this idea that feedback is, first of all, a gift, and that it's shining a spotlight on what is potentially a blind spot for you. So there's a wonderful book called Thanks for the Feedback, and it talks about not the process of actually giving the feedback, but preparing people and coaching people to actually receive feedback really well. Because as humans, it will be our natural tendency to potentially, feel quite defensive when we get feedback. So I think that idea of psychological safety, that idea of trust, and it coming back to that work of kind of Brene Brown, for example, and she talks about clear is kind. And actually, if we're talking about people who we are really invested in, who we care about deeply, and if you think about the word culture, comes from the Latin cultus, meaning to care. Actually, that the kind thing to do is to be clear in our feedback, to be clear in our conversations. And actually, I would be doing you a disservice if I wasn't clear. I think actually calling that out, having that conversation around feedback, talking about not only the process of giving feedback, but getting feedback. I think all of these are things, practical ways that we can contribute to a culture of, and I talk about one of the later chapters in the book is culture of continuous improvement, that no matter who we are, we're on a learning journey. And it comes back to what you just said, actually, about being in a hierarchy. And I always find that puts a certain level of pressure and tension on things, because it almost puts, leaders in a position of this hero who's got it all together, who knows everything and doesn't need any further development. But actually, if we as leaders are able to model that we are always continuously developing, no matter what stage we are in our career, it contributes to this idea of, well, we're all on a learning journey. We're all learning. And so actually, we're all receiving feedback. And the leader be asking for feedback on their performance, I think, can be quite powerful. I need feedback just as much as I'm giving you feedback.
Well, it's a brave leader that does that. And also anyone in management who will have a tendency to try to manage from the top down, in an authoritarian way, in a charismatic way. Indeed, I think there's a long tendency in my career, I noticed over the years, to try and find the superhead, the teacher who would come into the school, swoop in and impose their charismatic leadership over the school and turn it around and so on.
It's interesting because I think, where there is improvement in schools, I would kind of argue that actually that's come about because those cultures of trust and safety have been created. And quite often, trust is established in places where leaders are able to share their own vulnerabilities. And actually, it is a really hard thing to do. And you're absolutely right. It's a brave leader. It takes a brave leader to say, actually, no, I've messed that up. Or that's something I need to look at or rethink. But actually, in those really successful teams that have, brought about really great school improvement, I find that it's a kind of combination of the leader creating those spaces by sharing their own vulnerabilities, but still being able to have that competency and that assertiveness to be the person that's kind of paving the way forward.
And it is that the important thing, that to get the staff to buy into it as a team, because your book describes teams, to buy into it as a team and to believe in it. It almost doesn't matter what the actual it is, in a way. I mean, clearly the it could be not very effective at all. But I mean, in the debate between progressive education, but in a sense, it doesn't really matter that, does it? It doesn't really matter whether the kids are walking silently down the corridor. The important thing is that the whole school believe in whatever that is. And it seems to me what you're saying is that the belief in what the purpose of the school isn't imposed from above, but is brought into by the whole organisation, and is established through connections of trust and cooperation and teamwork, and not through empty managerialism or slogans.
No, I think what you're highlighting is the purpose. It comes back to that sense of purpose and what the school stands for, and that might be shown in many ways. So through their vision, through their values, etc. But what a school stands for is have absolute clarity on what their why is, what is their purpose, and what they are going to do to achieve it. And I think you're right. I think that purpose will look different in different places, and that vision will look different in different places, and very much dependent on context. It will very much depend on the demographic a school is serving, the aims and the purposes that have been collectively and collaboratively decided upon. But actually, it's that getting everyone on board, getting everyone to understand that really clearly. And that element of, I think, again, that culture, a purposeful culture, is just, again, so powerful in the way that it can permeate through an organisation, through a school.
A phrase I particularly liked in your book was confident humility as a management style. The idea of being, confident about the direction of the school and your expectations, and at the same time humble. We're kind of all in this together, and we're all going to make mistakes, including me.
Yeah, so I think the way it manifested to me is this understanding that culture is dynamic and therefore it has to be sustained. There is an understanding that it is a journey, that work needs to be done in sustaining it. But it is confident, and there is a real confidence there, and a real belief in the purpose.
I mean, a lot of what you're describing in the book, things like conversation, particularly with the idea of finding a balance between leadership and having conversations which recognise, I think the phrase you use, possibilities, conversations with possibility. So that you have a conversation in a school which says, well, what if we tried this? Does this work? I mean, could we do something differently? Even if so the school is constantly self-reflective. And yet the tension would be there between that and the kind of confident leadership we're describing. Well, it's really going to be really difficult, isn't it? Do you sometimes think you've written a book here which is going to say a lot? If I were a leader at a school, I'd go, oh, can I actually do this?
I think the first caveat to this entire book is that I've made it sound very, very easy. What I've tried to do in the book is pull together elements of organizational psychology with the emerging literature on educational leadership, which is pretty sparse. There's not much by way of educational leadership research, and I think Professor Coe's report was just the most encouraging and wonderful thing, in my opinion, because of the fact that it was bringing to light this, the kind of leadership element of this. I think everything is a balance. There's always a balance to be had. So I think conversations for possibilities are all about being open to having a conversation about change. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to change or it's going to be a constant cycle of change. I think the leaders who are leading on that change need to be really measured in their understanding of what the end goal is, and planning backwards from that. I think where conversations for possibilities are really powerful is that it opens up that discussion as something more than just the thought process of one individual leader. It then becomes a shared dialogue. And that shared dialogue then can inform a leader's decision making and sense making around a particular whatever it might be that they're discussing. I think it still lies with the leader and, to be making those hard decisions, but actually it becomes much more of a shared endeavour and shared dialogue around, right, let me get and collate all pieces of evidence about what this could be, and then I can be in a more informed position about shaping this going forward. And I think conversations for possibilities are great for that. I think it's also great to encourage others to be challenging respectfully, upwards, and challenging our leadership team when we're talking about things. And, I don't think yes people are necessarily the best things for school improvement. I think you need to have difficult conversations and say, well, what about this? And what about that? And could it be this? And I think we need to equip everyone with that kind of vernacular around, healthy debate, healthy challenge. So I think it can go hand in hand, but it is a very delicate balance. And I think, again, the work of leaders is so complex. And I hope, and I guess it was really the intention of the book to just have a starting point around some of the commonalities that I was seeing in schools that had really strong team cultures and school cultures, and that we're able to use that to impact student outcomes, to change things. And being in those shoes myself as well, I think has been a really useful experience. So a lot of my experiences, I think, have informed the thinking in the book.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
You are listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. This week, my guest is Lekha Sharma, author of books on education, and we are discussing her latest book, Building Culture, a handbook to harnessing human nature to create strong school teams. Have you ever had an experience of either in your own career or going into a school and you thought this is not the way it should be done? This has got a, I mean, you don't have to name any schools, but where you thought, well, this is I'm learning how not to do it here. Because I can personally think I have. I mean, I taught at schools where there was a tremendously creative and cooperative culture, and another school I taught at for a while where there was almost a bullying culture, where there was a good degree of fear and cynicism. And I would say that it was overt. You could feel it in the atmosphere at the school.
I think for me, the biggest lesson that I've learnt around leadership and culture is that it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, and you can have the best will in the world and all the right intentions and have all the tools in your toolkit, but actually it takes time, and it happens in the small interactions, the daily interactions that build up over time, and we cannot expect things to shift at pace. And I think it would be worrying if they did shift at pace, because we want something sustainable. We want something with longevity that's going to, and that's the whole point of culture, that it's a long-term game, that it can be sustained, that it becomes part of how we do things around here. So I think for me, there's definitely been times in my career I've just had to go, no, Lekha, slow down. This is, Rome was not built in a day. You have to hit pause on this and even pull back and say, actually, no, we need to, I thought we were going to do this, but actually had a change of heart and we're going to go in a different direction because actually it's not the right time for us.
And why do you think that happened, and how did you react to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that was around rationale, me having a really clear sense of the direction I wanted us to go in, that not being really clear to everyone else. And again, really important lesson learned. was to make sure that those I lead had a really clear understanding of the why. Why are you doing something? What is the purpose of this? The so what? And there's a really great, and I write about him in the book, Hooman Harouni, who's a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School for Education. And he says, it's usually registered as people whining, like, why do we have to do this? But actually, that's a really great question. It's a valid question for people to ask. Well, what's the point? Like, why? And actually, we should all have a really clear answer for that. And if we don't, then actually we're potentially wasting really valuable resource, time, and effort and energy into something that's not going to serve our broader purpose, that's not going to serve our pupils, and therefore is unlikely to have any impact on their outcomes. So yeah, I think that would definitely be something that I've learned along the way.
It's surprising, really, how obvious that sounds, and yet it's not obviously exemplified in every school. That sense of having the big picture, sharing in an idea of where this school is and what the purpose of education is for. And the purpose of education can be pulled into the micro things, like the end of term, the getting the exam results up this year, concentrating on the year 10s because there's something here, making sure that we're ready for the next Ofsted. So I think there's a way in which the tide of our education system, particularly, Ofsted's clearly in the news right now a lot, and the tide has pulled schools into themselves, but they've become very micro, concentrating on the next thing, the thing that has to be done. I'm wondering if I interviewed a guest a few weeks ago who had done a study of the Finnish education system, and in Finland they have many of the features. You think to yourself, well, goodness me, this is the features you're describing in your book. Highly cooperative ideas. The teachers work as teams. The schools in different areas, locales, cooperate with each other to observe what they're doing, and they don't have an inspection system, which produces, which is outcome based alone, which with hard edged judgments on a school. To some extent, do you think the way we've done education in this country the last few years, as it were, particularly with Ofsted and so on, and the movement towards competition between schools, has mitigated to some extent against the sort of school you're describing? How can you be the school you're describing in this environment?
And I think this is where the complexity lies for leaders, because leaders are torn between Ofsted preparedness kind of agenda versus real, deep, long-term school improvement. And that tension is really, really quite a challenging one for a leader. And so a lot of the things I talk about in the book, psychological safety, trust, a culture of continuous improvement, become quite difficult to do in a context that's wholly focused on getting to a certain point and not thinking about beyond that point. So yeah, I think it's certainly made it a challenge for schools to establish some of the things that I've been talking about in the book. Having said that, I've worked with leaders who yes, have had to keep an eye on Ofsted and have had to do the preparedness that you would have to do, but are still really focused on creating that strong school culture. And it gives me hope that, although it is incredibly challenging and no one's getting it completely perfect all of the time, and that's okay, that it is possible to create those kind of cultures and I think to, again, stay focused on why we do what we do and to make sure that the answer is never for Ofsted. And again, a lot of that comes back to the communication, the language we're using in our professional learning sessions, the language we're using day to day. Are we talking about our purpose and fulfilling that, or are we talking about ticking criteria for Ofsted? And so that is very much a mindset shift. And I think you have to go in really clearly on that as a leader and actually make a real statement about, actually, we are here for our pupils to serve a particular purpose. We're not doing this for Ofsted. They will come along and do their thing. Okay, but actually that's not why we're here. That comes through so many different things, the language, the way you're doing things, professional learning, having a long-term aim. And the one thing that you said that really resonated there with me is transparency. leaders do an awful lot of work behind the scenes around school improvement, strategic thinking and priorities and mapping and all of these things, that wonderful things, that really heavy thinking, but how often is that shared in a meaningful way with staff? And actually how wonderful it would be if, and I would encourage leaders to be more transparent about, this is where we are as a school, this is what we need to work on and what we're going to focus in on because it's important to us, and this is the direction of travel, and this is what we're going to focus on. And it's not a million things, it's 3 things. And it's going to be the only 3 things that we're focusing on. It doesn't matter who comes knocking at our door. I think there's definitely a balance and there's a tension there for sure. Very delicate balance for leaders to strike.
I've certainly been at meetings in schools where a phrase something like, well, if Ofsted see this, we're in trouble. And you realise that what you've been told effectively is, here's a game that we have to play and we have to tick this box. Not this thing in itself is a bad thing, or this thing itself is a good thing, or this thing itself is not something we believe in. And having a school that believes in something, and you think, well, obviously, what schools must believe in, it must be a very idealistic place to work in, a school. You must believe in what could be more delightfully idealistic than the improvement of young people, offering opportunities to young people. And yet it can be easily subverted into, as you said, I like the phrase you used, a tick box. You have to achieve this particular thing to achieve this particular thing. Right at the beginning of your book, in the first chapter where you talk about the psychological safety, there was not an anecdote, a study you cite. And by the way, your book is amazingly researched. Goodness me, that must have taken a fair amount of work. How you did that on top of being working as well, I don't know. But anyway, one of the studies you cite was where a team that was judged to be a very effective team, they were working together, I think it was in the health service setting, the study showed that they'd recorded more mistakes and more errors, even though they were judged to be a very good team, than teams were not judged to be such an effective team, made fewer errors. And you think, well, that's counterintuitive. Surely the good team is working like a well-oiled machine. And what the answer was fairly straightforward, that they were just more honest. They were able to express the mistakes. And that old thing, you learn from your mistakes. Well, there's a really profound lesson there, that schools have to be honest about their failings. That's a hard thing to be, isn't it? As you personally and in schools.
I would, and I think the idea of evidence-informed practice and evidence-informed research, I think, has a role to play here, because when we talk about evidence-informed best bets, we're talking about having a clear understanding of what works and having enough evidence to back that up, essentially. And I think in a real practical sense, how amazing it would be that if the staff could come together and, instead of talking about what's gone really well, which, absolutely we should be celebrating, talking about something that's been implemented and went really badly and what they've learned from it, because it's natural, it's going to happen. Implementation is incredibly complex and it's not always going to go the way we want it to go. But actually normalizing things not going well, but actually the skill here would be to pick it up quickly and to change course of action, to not get bogged down in, but I've put in a lot of effort into this, or I've spent a lot of money on that. This has to work and I've got to prove that it works. To actually normalize saying, well, that hasn't worked and we need to do a bit of a post-mortem and what went wrong and what we can learn for next time. And having those kind of conversations, alongside a really healthy culture of celebrating success and doing that too. But actually, why we're not normalizing it, I think there's a lot to say for just kind of moving the ego out of the way and saying, that didn't work, we need to move on. Let's think about what needs to happen next.
And that is, of course, so hard, isn't it, to move the ego out of the way, especially when, as a leader, as a manager, you want to exemplify, confidence and leadership, all the charismatic qualities that could be, you feel, undermined by admitting that didn't work, or when someone stands at a meeting and says, "Well, that's a really daft idea," and that idea that you can normalise and accept a certain degree of creative conflict within schools. They should be places where people have different ideas, and meetings aren't delivery. They can also be discussion. I mean, I think you devote a whole chapter to the idea of conversation. how much conversation isn't just about how many pens we need next term. Conversation can be about, why are we doing this? Yeah, and I think that's important. I remember I taught for a while in the United States, and I remember thinking that the school I taught at, the high school I taught at, was very, very sort of hierarchical in the sense that they didn't discuss much other than things to do with how many pens we need next term and whether the photocopier is working. And the school I came from in the UK, there was a strong sort of theoretical, lots of discussions were about, almost too much discussions about why we're doing this. And yet it did bond people together. When you talk about why are we teachers? I mean, that conversation could seem like a pointless navel-gazing. Yeah, I have a feeling it could be quite creative and useful and bonding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think purpose is something that we don't talk about enough, because I think people kind of assume it is the fluffy stuff. It's something we talk about on the inset day at the first day of the year, and then we don't come back to it. But I think particularly when you're in the thick of a school year and it is just constant and, 100 miles an hour, which schools tend to be, actually pausing to go, right, let's remind ourselves of our why, let's remind ourselves of our purpose, and actually can be a really healthy way of deciding, whether to do something or not, to make a decision about whether to implement something or not. Well, actually, does that serve our purpose? And this idea of moving seamlessly from task to purpose and purpose to task. I love that idea, again, from Houman Hourouni, but he talks about this idea, like, what am I doing right now? And is this serving the overarching purpose? How often do we sit back and think, even if it's really kind of a mundane thing we might be doing day to day, but actually, is this helping? Is this serving my purpose? Is it not? And if it's not, why am I doing it? Because we are time poor as leaders, as teachers, in schools in general, we're very time poor. So it's important we, I guess, cut all of the things that don't matter out of the equation so that we can focus on the things that do matter and do make a difference in terms of student outcomes.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
And studies of what most teachers most find stressful. At the top will be administrative tasks they don't feel are valuable. And of course, we are in a uniquely data-rich age. It's an astonishing what we can gather now. I mean, and the way you can survey both the students and the teachers and the whole process can gather information together to such an extent that there's a danger you start to serve the data. How do you ensure that a culture allows teachers to be free to be their own eccentric, quirky, in the classroom doing their own particular thing, at the same time using evidence and using data effectively?
I think a lot of that comes back to leaders having very specific knowledge around things like assessment and curriculum. And, you can look to things like the EEF's reports, which talk about, assessment and how, thinking about the work of Daisy Christodoulou and talking about assessment, how we use it and how we can make use of it. I think teachers and leaders having that up-to-date knowledge is really, really crucial. And I think that's probably a big caveat of the whole book, is that yes, we can have these brilliant, wonderful, trusting cultures that are psychologically safe and wonderful, but it all has to be underpinned by that domain-specific knowledge around curriculum and pedagogy and assessment. Because then what a leader is able to do is combine this knowledge of, okay, well, I need assessment to inform teaching and learning. I want it to be meaningful, but I can't have it taking up more time, that, a ridiculous amount of time for my teachers. It can't be onerous. Okay, so I'm going to decide that this is the best bet to go in this direction for assessment. And now I can think about how I'm going to implement that and how I'm going to support the culture around that wraps around that implementation, rather than ploughing ahead with something that potentially is going to damage culture because it is too onerous and because it is causing angst amongst a team. And actually that is that's a really dangerous place to be in, because when you've got really stressed out teachers that don't have the bandwidth to explore, then you can sit for hours and talk about purpose, and all they're going to be thinking about is the next data drop. So they need to have the headspace, they need to have the bandwidth to be able to explore these wider things like purpose. And the way to do that is to make sure that we've got really smart systems and structures in place in our schools that are well thought out, that are informed by the best bets and the evidence, and making sure leaders are equipped with the knowledge that they need to make those decisions around not only what to do, but how to do it.
Yes, and I like the use of the word smart there. And I think a lot of processes that are attached to assessment, and of course you need assessment, absolutely you do, of course you do. But when they become processes, as you rightly say, where teachers feel that oh my goodness, we've got to do the second assessments over this particular group, or my data must be put in by the end of the week, and you're getting reminders on your emails, and you're trying to teach at the same time, and you feel that what's actually been created is a process that serves itself. In other words, the main objective of this data collection is the data collection. And yet finding a way in which that can be balance the needs of the teachers and actually be practically useful. They can say, well, yeah, I'm doing this because it helps. This informs my teaching. It's hard to do. Goodness me, teaching's hard, isn't it?
It is really hard.
I'm retired now, so I can look back at this and go, goodness me, teaching's hard. One of the chapters in your book is called the flexible school, or a flexible approach to the school. So you've got this, again, this is going to be difficult to anyone listening to this, that you've got to have tight ideas and loose ideas, autonomy of the teacher, and yet a kind of degree of uniformity as well. So, good luck to you, teachers, and managers. Balance that. Be clear on what the school's about, but on the other hand, allow teachers to be creative and individual and eccentric and themselves. How do you manage that?
Good question. I mean, this is one of, by far, the most challenging things, I think. And I still find this challenging. And at the moment, I work as a curriculum and assessment school improvement leader for a trust. So I work at a trust level across schools. And even now, this balance between autonomy and consistency is one that I find really, really complex. I think it's about identifying and again, I keep talking about purpose, but if you keep coming back to the sense of purpose, it just illuminates everything that you're doing. Because if I know that I'm doing, and we take, for example, a teaching and learning pedagogy kind of framework for a classroom teacher, as an example. So I'm a senior leader, I'm coming in and I'm saying, well, actually, these are the tools I'm going to provide. We're going to do some CPD around this, and this is going to be a teaching and learning framework that you use. When we're talking about tight, it's about selecting the kind of active, and the EEF refer to it as active ingredients, the things that are really going to make the difference, and really protecting those. And so those are going to be the things that we are unpicking and talking about in our professional learning sessions. Those are going to be the things that, the common and shared language that we're going to develop. When we talk about loose, it's the recognition that there's a context to every single classroom that can't just be scooped up within one framework, one policy, one whatever it might be. So it's the ability, I think, for teachers and leaders to recognise that there will always be a context, and we have to be context considerate. And so for me, a way to manage that is, whenever there's implementation of anything through professional learning, for example, to have a follow-up where teachers are able to have a platform to discuss where they've had to flex. This is how I've implemented it in my classroom, but this is the context of my classroom, and actually I've had to do this slightly differently, and this is the adaptation I've had to make. Because it's through those conversations that, as a leader, you're able to say, but you've protected that key thing that we're trying to get really right, that's been informed by the evidence that we're trying to really implement, but actually you've adapted it in this way to meet a need, and have those conversations openly as a staff. So I think it's about going on, first of all, having a sequence of professional learning is really important, because it allows you to go back and reflect in hindsight on where you have had to flex an approach, or where you have had to adapt a particular approach. It also allows for that approach to then be refined at a kind of core level. So a leader is then able to take feedback from that and say, actually, is that something that had to be refined at classroom level, or do I need to refine this at this, kind of core fundamental level? But again, an ongoing process of refinement and knowing that it's never done. And I think that's obviously something that with my curriculum hat on, I'm always saying curriculum is never done, but I don't think any sort of school improvement initiative is ever really done. I think you constantly have to loop round and cycle round to get it right. So yeah, the tight but loose approach, I think, and Jade Pierce, who writes a case study for that chapter, does a really excellent job of exemplifying what that looks like in schools. But I think it's so important to recognise that context is everything, whether it's at a classroom level, whether it's at a school level. It just drives so much of the thinking around implementation. We have to be able to flex to take into consideration the context.
And the context being the particular requirements of a subject, its particular... Could the context be an individual? Could someone say, well, this particular process, this is the way I do it? But you'd find within that the core of what you want, I suppose. But
yeah, this is a tricky one because, I think we have to find the balance between this is how I'm doing something and my rationale is that it's meeting the needs of the pupil in my class. But with this is how I'm doing it because I want to do it this way, personal preference. The problem with personal preference, in my eyes, is that there's no continuity or longevity to that. That person leaves and becomes a head of department somewhere or a head of year or goes on to wonderful things. And there's no longevity in that because that was their personal preference of how to do things. And I think culture is more enduring. It's about getting everybody on board with how to do things so that is instilled within the school, so that no matter who comes and goes and leaves, that's the culture that remains within the school. It's long term and it's enduring. So I think it depends on rationale. Is someone saying, this is how I do it because I'm just set in my ways and I just like doing it like this? Because that's a different conversation to I'm doing it with a very real rationale that's that I've thought about, is considered, is rooted in my pupils and not in me. And I think that, I think at a leadership and teacher level, there's loads to be said about coming back to the pupils at every turn. How is this impacting pupils? What will this, what impact will this have on my pupils? How am I going to adapt to my pupils? Whether that's at a leadership level and you're talking policy frameworks, all of that kind of stuff, or whether it's at a teacher classroom level and you're thinking, how am I going to adapt to meet the needs of my pupils? And it has to be the core, at the core of all of the conversations and the dialogue that we're having, I think.
So if you're talking to someone who says, well, I've never done that. It's not what I do in my room. In my classroom, I don't do that. And yet you feel that's important to the school. The way you would approach that would be say, well, let's look at the effect that has. Why we're doing this thing. Why I want you to do this thing. So you bring it back to the rationale behind it.
Yeah, and I'd also say, just have a go. Have a go. Give it a try, and just talk to me about the impact that it did or did not have. Because it's about opening up the discussion and meeting people where they are, not where you want them to be. And I think the manner in which you have that discussion, and I've been in discussions which are at the very extreme end of that, which is like, well, no, you just have to do it. And that's not where you want to be as a leader. You want to be having that discussion around, okay, well, let's talk this out. Let's talk about this, and where are we getting the evidence from this, and what's the rationale, and is it, how does this fit in with the wider context of our school improvement plan? But again, if a teacher doesn't know what the wider context of the school improvement plan is because it hasn't been shared, it's very hard for a teacher to then understand where they sit in that bigger picture, which is why I would really encourage leaders to, and it's not about sharing all of the nitty-gritty documentation with teachers, just a one-pager with your 3-4 priorities on it for this half term, for this term, for this year, and talking about how everything you're doing, how that fits into serving those 3 or 4 things.
And also, it's if the teachers, the staff, all of them, as a team, because your book again is about teams, believe in what they're doing, as opposed to feeling it's being imposed upon them. And I remember being at a school which was failing, it was doing very badly, and there was a real sense of them and us, that the managers said things in meetings and people walked out afterwards and said, well, that was a load of rubbish, or that'll never work, and yet they wouldn't say it at the meeting. Comes back to that idea again of being, able to speak up, able to say, able to trust, able to believe that you're part of this whole process. Really, again, difficult, but yeah, just so it's sort of so obvious and yet so difficult. I think that's one of the wonderful tensions about your book. You read it and think, well, yes, of course, I agree with this. Trust, conversation, rethinking, being evaluative, being honest. All these things must be true, and yet they're so often not. So I like the fact that you give some really good case studies and practical advice, and it's rooted again in a lot of research that went into the book here. One of the things that I think happened, maybe it happened before I started teaching, I'm not that old, but one of those things that happened during my career maybe was a feeling that teachers became a problem. As society, we were, most notoriously Michael Gove described teachers as the blob, and a feeling that what the good manager would do would be to root out the bad teachers, get in the good teachers, and make sure we all were doing our jobs properly. That feeling that teachers were in themselves a difficulty and had to be managed properly. And I don't know what your book is doing, in a sense, is saying that's completely wrong. You can trust teachers. They can trust themselves as well. And if I was reading your book and I wasn't a manager of a school, I would think, well, yeah, I'd like Laker to be my manager. I feel we'd have a good conversation, and it wouldn't be judgmental.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what the whole premise of the book is around, is this idea of being developmental, not judgmental, in every lens, with whatever you're doing, and creating that. All of the things that I talk about in the book is about creating those kind of safe cultures where the focus can be on school improvement for the pupils and the impact that it will have on pupil outcomes rather than anything else. And Vivian Robinson talks a lot about making sure that leaders are focusing their energy on the core business of teaching and learning. And actually the best way that we can do that is by making sure that we are all bought into this idea of focusing on that core business. And in order to do that, there needs to be, the conditions need to be right for that to happen. So I think we need to empower and trust teachers, and we need to treat them like the professionals that they are. And that involves having conversations. And that, I would welcome teachers coming to me and saying, actually, I don't agree with that. And I think too many leaders think that it's a sign of success to have everyone say, yeah, cool, we'll do it, and then leave the room and say, oh, that was rubbish, I don't want to do that. But actually, we should be welcoming that dissent. And I remember quite vividly something that I would always do ahead of any sort of implementation plan was go and speak to someone I knew would hate it and ask them to just poke all of the holes in it. Just tell me how much you hate this. Tell me what's wrong with it. Tell me all of the things that you would say you don't like about this. And it would give me really great food for thought. And sometimes I'd sit there and go, oh, that's a really good point. And it would just stress test that thinking and that planning ahead of going ahead and sharing it more widely. So yeah, I would say to leaders, welcome it, welcome the discussion, welcome the dialogue, because we're in such an exciting age where teachers are just, they're full of this, big brains and full of all this wonderful research and all of this brilliant stuff. We should be discussing. That's the way we move forward. That's the way we make progress.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
That reminds me of a sort of complete, not in teaching at all, but something in history where the new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, released from prison Andrei Sakharov, the dissident. And he said, well, I'm releasing you from prison. And they met Sakharov, and Sakharov, well, you say, look, you've released me from prison, but you know what's going to happen. I'm going to criticize you all the time. And he said, that's exactly why I've released you from prison. Our society needs that. Well, in a big picture sense, someone in the school that is going to be a good, useful person in the school is the person who is brave enough to speak up, and brave enough to say, well, why is that? To be the critic, to be the useful critic. As you say, that creative dialogue, which can be probably quite uncomfortable for leaders, and yet, buy into it, accept it. The continuous improvement. You end the book by talking about continuous improvement. Someone might say, well, don't we know how to run schools? I mean, surely we've been teaching since since Roman times, but in a modern sense, schools have been developing and developing. Why don't we just simply, do it like it was when I was a kid? And that's how we know. Why is there an ongoing dialogue in teaching about how to do something which we've been doing for decades and decades?
I think that, the evolution of educational research has completely, revolutionised the way we teach, and I think has offered us insights into how pupils learn, and therefore has huge implications on what we do in our schools and how we do it. I really look forward to a time where the same can be said for educational leadership, because the research is not as well established in that area, and it's something that what the research I do refer to in my book is from organisational psychology. I kind of refer and make links to Robert Coe's paper as well, but actually I think that has changed the trajectory of school improvement massively. And so I do think we need to constantly be questioning, what are the best bets? How are we going to get this right? And how can we be even better at every point? And I don't think that there will ever be a point where we should be, sitting pretty and going, oh, it's all great and we're doing really wonderful and we can just kind of cease thinking about stuff. And that goes for both schools that are performing not so great and schools that are performing really well. I think there's opportunity in both to have continuous improvement conversations about whether it's your curriculum offer, pedagogy, and hopefully in the future as well, leadership and how we're doing that.
That's interesting. The point you made there, I thought, was so good, that there's tremendous understanding of memory, of cognitive science, of neuroscience, and the workings of the human brain. We've advanced hugely in how we understand learning and the processes of learning. At the same time, schools are still largely sort of 19th century in structure. If someone came, I think I said this in a previous podcast, so apologies to anyone listening to this, but if you took someone from the 1880s and dropped them into a school today, they'd know where they were. And so I'm in a school. There's all sorts of differences, but I'm in a school. I can tell there are kids sitting in rows. There's someone instructing from the front. So that idea that we've used institutions that are really quite conservative and backward looking in a period of time when we know so much more about young people, emotional development, psychological development, mental health, and all these things that should be informing what we do in schools. It's one of, I think that seems to be a theme of our conversation, a kind of balance and a tension between really quite difficult decisions to make.
Yeah, and I think that's the really important point, is that we are letting those best bets guide what's happening in our classroom. And the thing that always really stands out for me is that, what are the best bets for leadership then? Because we've got this large body of knowledge that, through things like the National Professional Qualifications, this amazing opportunity for leaders to really get to grips with the core knowledge they need to be really great leaders. But it's that implementation, that really messy side of leadership that deals with actual people on the ground that are, disparate by nature and have different views and are, coming from different places at starting points and coming from different perspectives. How do we do that and get that bit right? And it's always that bit that's kind of really stumped me as a leader. And I've only really learned through experience of implementation and getting it right and then getting it really wrong and learning from that and kind of muddling through. And I think Professor Rob Coe's paper was really hopeful in that sense, because he was synthesizing the literature that is there and actually some really interesting findings from that, echoing some of the things that I mention in the book around, management factors like trust and psychological safety, was promising, because I think it bridged a gap, because there's organizational psychologists look at businesses all the time and think, how do we get leaders to be better business people for the purpose of increasing profit? And I just always wondered to myself, how are we applying this knowledge to our schools, and how leaders are leading schools when we have a really important purpose that goes far beyond profit making. But actually, how are we best informed to think about how we are doing things in our schools? Not what we are doing, because there is so much research and no doubt that will continue to grow. But actually, how are we doing it, and what should be guiding our thinking around how we're doing it? And there's lots of great tools out there, I think, for leaders in that domain. For example, the EEF's implementation guidance is a wonderful tool that I would encourage leaders to use if they're thinking about any sort of implementation, be it a small scale intervention or something more whole school. But it just scaffolds the leader's thinking around, right, what do I really need to think about ahead of this, during this, and to sustain this? And I love that. I love that as a toolkit. But I feel like there's so much more to be learnt about how we can get it right in schools and make sure that we've got really strong organising frameworks that are having impact on student outcomes.
We're coming to the end now. And so my last couple of questions, or question, is, you call your subtitle of your book is Harnessing, or part of your subtitle is Harnessing Human Nature. You chose that, I think. If you were to give advice to a school, to a leader of a school, and they said, well, what do you mean by harnessing human nature? How can I do that within my school? What would you say?
I think I would say having an awareness of some of the key principles that I talk about in the book. Things like how we can create psychological safety, how trust works, the idea that we need to give it to get it. All of these things, I think it's about having an awareness of them is the first step, really, to knowing how to, let it augment our practice as leaders. So I would say consider how often are implementation plans impacted by human thinking or feeling, and just have a think about that. Because actually, just an awareness of that will hopefully nudge leaders' thinking around this to consider how they are doing something and the way in which they're doing something, the manner in which they're doing something, whether that's the smallest decisions around language choice, or whether that's larger decisions around how they're conducting meetings to ensure that everyone feels safe to share and have a voice. I think awareness would be the first step, and then hopefully, what I'm really hopeful for, and I know that there are people in the sector doing some amazing research around culture and how it can impact student outcomes. I'm really hopeful that we have more research around this in the future that can more strongly guide our implementation within schools.
Thank you. I'm going to end it there, because that was such a wonderful summation of your book. And it was so, it captured the spirit of your book, which, while it's a handbook and a management guidance book, it's also very humane. And it was centred on being people in schools and not just systems. So, Lekha Sharma, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me.
You have been listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs. My guest this week, Lekha Sharma. We were discussing her book, Building Culture, a handbook to harnessing human nature to create strong school teams. I found it a useful reminder of how schools, and indeed any organisation, should be properly managed. It's not only a handbook that really any managers or indeed any members of an organisation would find useful, but also it highlighted the particular nature of schools, the creative, practical endeavour in which they're involved, how the tensions within schools between necessary information gathering, necessary efficiency, and yet a degree of creativity has to be balanced. And that can only really come about through discussion and a recognition that schools are special places engaged in a really rather idealistic pursuit to prepare the next generation. to prepare the future. If I were to imagine a school as described in Laker's book, I'd imagine one with lots of discussion, a great deal of respect, collegiality, an emphasis on human beings, not on empty managerialism. A useful reminder in a week where the Deputy Prime Minister has effectively gaslighted the nation, asserting that his bullying behaviour was little more than a figment of their imagination and their snowflake inability to deal with hard and harsh management. A reminder to all managers. Thumping the table, shouting, barking out orders, being demanding, actually is poor management practice. You can find this podcast now available on Podbean, on Spotify, and multiple other platforms. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.